April 22, 1951. This was the day when 1,000 Filipino soldiers proved they would not back down, even against 40,000 Chinese troops. This battle took place during the Korean War, a time when the Philippines sent troops to help South Korea in its fight against the communist nations of North Korea and China. But how did just 1,000 Filipino soldiers push back against 40,000 Chinese troops? That's exactly what we're going to uncover in today's video. Before we begin, don't forget to hit subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss out on our newest videos. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a surprise attack at the border of South Korea. They deployed 75,000 infantry troops, supported by armed brigades. South Korea was completely overwhelmed by the size and power of the North Korean military. The South was pushed back until Seoul, its capital, was captured. Since South Korea's military strength at the time was limited, they turned to America for help. The U.S. quickly deployed military forces to support South Korea. However, the Soviet Union and China were backing North Korea. This made it difficult for the U.S. to turn the tide, so they temporarily retreated and sought assistance from the United Nations, calling on allied nations to send military reinforcements. One of those allies was the Philippines. At that time, the Philippine president was Elpidio Quirino. The country was still slowly recovering from World War II, yet despite the economic and national challenges, President Quirino did not hesitate to support our friend South Korea. The Philippines became the first Asian nation to respond to the UN's call. In September 1950, Congress passed Republic Act 573, also known as the Philippine Military to the United Nations Act. President Quirino immediately authorized the deployment of 5 battalion combat teams composed of 7,420 Filipino troops. Here's what's inspiring. These soldiers were not handpicked by the president. They volunteered. Even Fidel Ramos, who would later become president, was among those who enlisted. Each of them offered their service wholeheartedly, fighting not for their own country, but for the freedom of others. They were called PEFTOK, the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea. On September 16th, the 10th Battalion Combat Team set sail and reached Korea after a 4-day journey. This battalion was highly trained in using tanks, composed of 1,400 officers and men. They arrived at the port of Busan on September 19, 1950, led by Colonel Mariano Azurin. From the moment they stepped off the ship, they were met with harsh cold. As they walked through the ruined streets, they saw devastated buildings, Koreans begging on the streets, hungry, crying, and weak. Many had no idea what to do, carrying whatever belongings they could. The moment the Korean civilians saw the Filipino soldiers, they ran toward them, begging for food. Moved with compassion, the Filipino soldiers gave them whatever rations they had. Seeing this, they were reminded of how the Philippines once suffered under Japanese occupation. So they made a vow. They would fight with everything they had to stop communism, even if it meant risking their lives for people they didn't even know. They soon found out that nearly 80% of South Korea had fallen to communist forces. The remaining 20% was guarded by UN forces led by the Americans. When the 10th Battalion arrived, they had no tanks. The Americans had promised to provide them, but most of those tanks were already destroyed during earlier assaults by the North Koreans. The Americans were only able to supply 1 tank and several heavy weapons, which the Filipino troops gladly accepted. The 10th Battalion spent weeks training, studying the terrain, testing their weapons, and developing battle strategies. They were deployed from Busan to Sarawal in the bitter cold of North Korea. Temperatures dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius, yet the Filipinos had no thick jackets or winter gear, enduring extreme cold on top of the horrors of war. On November 11, 1950, the 10th Battalion went on a patrol mission with U.S. forces from Muodong to Sinsil. The patrol was led by Filipino officer Colonel Max Yang, who rode a tank while the other soldiers marched behind. U.S. troops in war jeeps followed at the rear. What they didn't realize was that a North Korean base was just a few kilometers away. As they turned toward a mountain pass, the North Koreans opened fire, catching the battalion off guard. From inside his tank, Colonel Yang looked through the telescope and saw his comrades frozen in fear. So he drove the tank straight up the hill, located the North Korean shooters, grabbed the machine gun, and opened fire. The thunderous roar of his machine gun startled the North Koreans, who began to flee. Yang rained down bullets on them, and his fellow Filipino soldiers, inspired by his courage, rose up and fired back. Dozens of North Koreans were killed. Many tried to shoot Yang, but no bullet touched him. After 30 minutes, the enemy retreated. In the aftermath, 42 North Koreans lay dead. Among the Filipinos, there were only injuries, no deaths. They seized the enemy base, and this marked the first Filipino victory in the Korean War. The Americans were deeply impressed and nicknamed them the Fighting Filipinos. After that win, they marched forward to Sinsil. On the night of April 22, 1951, in the northern part of Yeoncheon, the 10th Battalion Combat Team, as part of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, faced a massive invasion from Chinese and North Korean troops. This was the Great Spring Offensive, one of the biggest attacks from the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and North Korea's Communist forces during the war. Facing the Filipinos were about 40,000 soldiers from 4 Chinese divisions. Past midnight, the Chinese began the attack with intense artillery fire, followed by waves of infantry. However, they struggled against the strong defenses set up by the Filipinos using tanks and artillery. But the Chinese focused their main assault on the center, where the Turkish battalion was stationed. Overwhelmed, the Turks retreated. On the flanks, Puerto Rican troops also abandoned their posts. This opened up a deadly gap in the defense line. With the Puerto Ricans falling back, the Chinese were able to break through and surround the Filipino troops. This gave them a path to attack the 10th Battalion head-on. But one Filipino platoon, positioned on a hill overlooking the town of YULTONG, refused to retreat. They held the line. Not a single Filipino moved back. They used bayonets, grenades, and even hand-to-hand combat to push back any enemy who came close. Despite being encircled by 40,000 Chinese soldiers, Lieutenant Arteaga stood firm, refusing to back down. This bought enough time for Captain Conrado Yap to lead a counterattack. That move rescued the trapped platoon and stopped the enemy advance, but both Arteaga and Yap were killed in the fight. At dawn on April 23, Lieutenant Colonel Ojeda launched a second counterattack, this time using M24 tanks. The Chinese were overwhelmed, forced to retreat from the mountain they hoped to capture. The Filipino soldiers fought on until noon before finally receiving orders to fall back and regroup with Allied forces. In that battle, 15 Filipinos were killed, 26 wounded, and 14 went missing in action. In contrast, about 500 Chinese soldiers died. The defense at Yultong allowed the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division to safely retreat and regroup. This strategic moment shifted momentum in favor of the Allied forces, leading to repeated losses for the Chinese and North Koreans. Eventually, they were forced to request a ceasefire. Out of the 7,420 Filipino soldiers deployed to Korea, 113 died, 313 were wounded, 15 were missing, and 41 became prisoners of war. To honor their bravery, South Korea built a monument inside their war memorial, where the names of these heroic Filipinos are engraved, forever remembered in the pages of history.